having been subjected to acts that are capable of affecting their right to exist, right of existence, right? This is where, I mean, they're kind of dancing around the word genocide because it has a very specific meaning. So mass killings, widespread rape, beatings, destructions of villages and homes. And then the Gabon has described this as systematic clearance operations, widespread systematic clearance operations, right? So in response, Myanmar's or Aung San Suu Kyi's response in the International Court of Justice. So you can read her testimonials as well. So one response is it's not really easy to establish a clear pattern of events, right? So basically a response of the type that there's a lot of fear on both sides, there's attacks happening back and forth, that there's some symmetry to this violence that's happening. This is not genocide, this is like a internal conflict in Myanmar, right? That's the story, okay? And the other defense is that, look, a lot of these charges of genocide are on the basis of like victim testimonies, so like from refugees who've been displaced over in Bangladesh right now, and they have bias. I mean, they have some biases. They have systematic reasons to kind of exaggerate their narrative, right, or provide inaccurate information in order to receive support, right? So what we would like to do is, given the argument that's happening on the basis of, let's call it qualitative information, right, and not large sample data and systematic information. So what we wanted to do here is come in and use quantitative tools and large sample data to try and evaluate these competing narratives, right? Is there really something to what Aung San Suu Kyi is claiming about that there being violence on both sides? Is it really symmetric? Is it the case that some of the Buddhist attacks on Muslims, on the minority Rohingya Muslims, is reactionary, right? Or do we see any kind of systematic economic motivations behind this? Okay, so that's what we're trying to do now at this, and there's of course so that's kind of, I gave you the motivation on the basis of kind of our own passion and policy interest in this topic, but on the other hand, when we start analyzing the systematic economic motivations, this actually is connected to a large literature in both economics and political science on the drivers of conflict, right? And as I go along, I'll try and explain where our analysis fits into this broader literature on why conflict occurs. And like an important, there's a lot of papers, I won't go through each one of them given the short time, but like one important framework that we will build off of is this paper by Undrilla, Dubé, and Vargas in Colombia that looks at the economic motivation behind conflict in Colombia. Okay, and so we're going to do 3 or 4 things. I might actually, if I have time, I'm going to show you a 4th piece that we might not get to. Okay, and actually, before I talk about what exactly we're doing, given that there's in the audience there's a lot of younger researchers, PhD students, etc., I just want to be clear that, okay, this is kind of an unusual research approach in economics, unusual talk. And I want to be clear that this might not be the most sensible type of research to do for younger researchers, right? Because I mean, like part of why people attend seminars is to try to get a sense of like what research is being done and what types of approaches to take when you're starting your career. So I'll just say that this is kind of a risky paper to write, right? Because it doesn't fit the standard mold of economics papers where we're trying to build a narrative, we're building a story on the basis of like 3 different and non-overlapping pieces of evidence, right? And you should talk to your advisors before embarking on projects like this. And so, okay, so here's what we're going to do. So number 1 is that we are going to use fluctuations in the price of rice, which is one of the most important economic commodities in Myanmar, to understand whether or not when there are when the economic benefit of looting and displacement and persecution is high, during those periods and in those places, do we see increases in conflict, right? So that's how we're going to try and make the case that there are some systematic economic motivations behind the conflict, which is not consistent with, congruent with the narrative that Aung San Suu Kyi had been, on behalf of Myanmar, had been trying to push, which is that, there's some violence on this side, violence on that side, it's random, somebody attacks, somebody has to attack back. Okay. That's one. Second, we're going to do, so this is for number one, and I also put it first, partly because we're going to try and make some causal statements using instrumental variable strategies, right? Looking at fluctuations in rice prices. Okay. Now, second is explicitly descriptive, right? But we're going to try and provide a rich kind of description of the dynamics of conflict here, right? And to do that, we'll use these vector order regressions. So, so the types of approaches that are more common in macro than in applied micro, the type of field that development economics has become. Okay, and the description here is going to be the type where, if there's an attack, what type of response do we see? Okay, so let's say if let's start with the narrative that Aung San Suu Kyi started, which is imagine that we start on day one, there is an attack by ARSA on military outposts, right? What happens in the subsequent 30 days? Okay, so we're going to try and describe the dynamics of the conflict, right? And such that we look at what the initial action was, what the reaction was, what type of fatalities occurred by the initial actor, like the perpetrator, and what type of fatality occurs in the other direction. And when I say rich description, it's also because what we can do is compare the military's response to the Rohingya or military's attack on the Rohingya, and contrast that against the military's response to other ethnic conflicts that are happening in Myanmar at the same time. Okay, so we'll have to use data on all conflicts. Like there's a very rich data set, ACLED, on all conflicts that happen around the world, including daily data on the occurrence of all conflicts. Okay. So we're going to try to answer the question is, like, what does this conflict look like? And is the violence against the Rohingya different from the violence that we see in other interethnic conflict? Okay. And then the third thing we'll do is go back to our data that we collected in Bangladesh from the Rohingya refugees, as well as like host community members in Bangladesh, right? On how bad the psychological trauma effects of the crisis have been, and the displacement has been. Okay. Okay, and then the fourth thing that we can do if I have time, I'll get to, but maybe I'll just mention it briefly here because I might not get time, is that not only can we look at the effects on trauma, the psychological effects of the displacement and being subjected to, witnessing murder and rape, right? But we can also look at how much the Rohingya have lost economically, given up and lost as they were displaced, right? So the reason this is useful is that we can then see whether the economic losses as reported on the Bangladesh side of the border is congruent with the kinds of losses and looting that we see on the Myanmar side of the border. Okay, so I'm going to start with we'll just go 1, 2, 3, okay, in that order. All right, so what's the rice and economic motivations? How do we establish that? Okay, so first notice that rice is the most important staple food in Myanmar. It accounts for almost half of all agricultural production, and it's mostly wetland rice. Okay, and so therefore suitability is, so it's not like irrigated. So that means suitability of a particular location matters a lot for rice productivity. So there are some locations like the Irrawaddy Valley, which are particularly suitable for rice production, where productivity is going to be high compared to other locations around Myanmar. And we can use the FAO data on suitability index in order to identify what those places are, right? And second thing that will be useful for identification is that Myanmar is a price taker in the global rice market, right? So it exports 9% of its domestic crop, but its export is only 4% of the world share of rice trade, okay? And that means that any rice price fluctuations within Myanmar is unlikely when any rice production fluctuations within Myanmar is unlikely to affect international rice prices. And therefore we can use fluctuation in international rice prices as an instrument for how valuable a particular location, a particular piece of land in Myanmar is at any given moment. Okay, and then here's the underlying FAO data. So on the left, you have a map of Myanmar as a whole, right? And on the right, we've zoomed in to this particular state in Myanmar called Rakhine, right? And Rakhine is a state where the vast majority of the Rohingya live. So Bangladesh, the southern Bangladesh is right here in this corner, right? This is why the movement, like the refugee movement, occurs across this border. Okay? So this is just to point out that rice suitability varies across Myanmar, and it also varies within Rakhine. Okay, so that's going to be part of our underlying variation in the data, right? It's a variation in the suitability for growing rice. Some areas are much more productive than others. Okay? And so one of the so in the literature there are opposing mechanisms by which increases in suitability, so like increases in productivity of a particular resource, can have on conflict. So one effect, I think this was termed by that Dubé-Vargas paper, is the rapacity effect, which is that if a place becomes more, if a place is more suitable for rice growing, or you're in a period where it's particularly attractive because the international market price of rice is high, right? Then that leads to an increase in the payoff for engaging in conflict from looting, taking ownership over somebody else's resource, right? So the incentives for appropriation go up. Okay, and in fact, we are going to show this using very different sources of data, like using data on conflict, rice price variation internationally, et cetera. We're going to use large sample for this, but this is consistent with some of the stories that have been coming out, right? Which is in Myanmar, which is about, okay, for example, now that the Rohingya have been displaced and they've left their fields, right, uncultivated, what should Myanmar be doing, right, with those fields? Should they be appropriating it, and should they be selling that rice? So this is like the types of mechanisms we are going to be sort of indirectly uncovering using the large sample data, right? Since then, this is recent. It's become a topic of discussion as to how to actually take advantage of this. Okay. So one mechanism is that it increases the value of the returns to appropriation, right? Another mechanism that's been noted in the literature is that it can also increase the opportunity cost for conflict, right? So imagine that. So in the Dubé-Vargas paper, right, they talk about like different crops, one which might be capital intensive and the other labor intensive. So when there is a crop that's labor intensive, you might think that, okay, so if say coffee is labor intensive in Colombia, right? Then if the world market price of coffee goes up, then you have more reason to try and intensely focus on harvesting coffee, right? Which may act as which may increase the opportunity cost of engaging in conflict because people are actually busy doing the coffee business. Okay. So as a result, like in the literature, you see these two opposing effects, right? And so it's going to be an empirical question as to which of these effects would dominate, right? But note in our case, right, when in the Colombia case, there might be multiple groups that are equal in size and power that are engaging in conflict over some, possibly common resource, right? But in our case, something that's going to be different is that hugely asymmetric power. There's the Myanmar military security forces against a small, poor minority. Okay. All right, and so just to give you a visual description of the empirical strategy that we're going to be using, right? So the Economist magazine wanted to cover this, but then ultimately chose not to. So we produced these maps for them, and I felt like we spent a lot of time producing the maps. I'm going to use them on you, okay? Before showing the regressions. Okay, so the black area that's shaded, like those are the areas that are the most rice suitable areas. So this is the Irrawaddy Valley. This is low-lying and really good wetlands for rice. Okay, and so what we have is on the left side is a period when the world rice price is low. So the incentives for appropriation are low, and on the right side are periods when the world rice price is particularly high. So the incentives for looting is particularly high, right? So basically what the regressions that I'll show you will ultimately produce patterns like this, which is that what you observe is that as the price of rice goes up, then conflict, which is in red, right? Conflict starts moving disproportionately more into the areas where rice price suitability is high. So that's kind of the interaction effect. That's why I have like 2 colors here times 2 maps, right? The interaction effect is rice price suitability times the change in the world market price. So that's essentially what we're going to show you, right? But in regressions. So we'll do that by looking at, as a dependent variable, various measures of conflict. So we'll have attacks against, say, the Rohingya, or attacks against another minority. We'll have attacks by the military against the Rohingya, right, as a dependent variable. And we'll also have looting, right, in a given location. So this is going to have a subscript I and T. So this is a location, a township I, and time period T, and T is measured in month. Okay. And then on the right side, the variable of interest will be the one, the coefficient of interest is going to be beta, where the variable is rice suitability, which varies, this is from the FAO, and this varies spatially across Myanmar. So that's the, in my map, that's the black shaded area versus the rest. Okay, except that it's going to be a continuous measure. In this map, I just showed you the highest suitability area, but it's going to be a continuous measure of suitability. Okay, so that's suitability times the price of rice, which is going to vary by month and year. And this is so say we want to start with the price in Myanmar. So that's the MMR. Okay, and we're going to lag the price by a month, and then we'll control for a whole set of fixed effects. So for example, month, year fixed effects. So there might be seasonal effects, etc., in conflict and rice production. So we'll control for that through the fixed effects. Okay, and then the second thing we'll do is that this domestic price, right, we will instrument that by the international rice price. Okay, and in fact, I think we end up using the international price. I mean, of course, there are many different rice varieties. We end up using the international price for Pakistani basmati rice because that's one of the closest substitutes for the rice that Myanmar produces. Okay. And so the instrument, I'm not going to click through this, but the the domestic price in Myanmar tracks the international prices quite closely. Okay. And so the null hypothesis here is that these economic motivations do not drive ethnic conflict in Myanmar, right? And then we would reject the null under 2 conditions. So one is if beta is negative, right, then that opportunity cost mechanism, which is that, oh, now we need to all be busy producing rice, therefore we don't have time for conflict, right? That would produce beta, a negative beta. Or if rice prices go up and that increases the incentives to expropriate, then beta would be greater than 0.
Mushfiq, one quick question. A couple of questions have come up on the chat that I think it's better to clarify before you show your results. And both are related to the mechanics of the conflict here. Who is doing the looting? Who owns the land? So there's a question from Rajesh Ramachandran asking who is doing the looting here, the military or people incentivized to participate in violence when the gains from looting are high. And then Santiago Saavedra is asking, wouldn't the rapacity or employment effects depend on who owns the land?
Yes. Okay. Good. So let me spend a moment just explaining the context, and maybe Jaya and Paula can add in the chat as well. So the context here is we are talking about land that's occupied. So maybe if I go back to the Rakhine map. Okay. Okay. So here's a Rakhine map of Rakhine where the Rohingya live. Right. So what's happening right now, I mean, is that there are Rohingya who are living on this piece of land, right? And they live in villages and they are cultivating the land. They're cultivating rice on the land surrounding their villages. Okay. And the displacement that occurs is that sometimes these villages get looted and burned. So the Rohingya are forced out. Okay. And their land is left, of course, left after they become refugees. And they might be left uncultivated. And so what's going on is the Rohingya we're talking about extraction of land that the Rohingya were owning and cultivating, right? So looting that. So either, I mean, the looting could also be, okay, I'm interested in looting the rice crop for this year, right? But the other form of looting could be, I'm interested in displacing you, so I now have control over the land. Okay. So the perpetrator of the violence is therefore the people who are who are burning the villages and forcing the Rohingya out, right? And the victims here are going to be the people who were living there. In this case, Rohingya minority Muslims who are being pushed out. Does that cover the context?
And I guess the mechanics of the conflict is such that the military attack, and then the local population also participates in the looting, and they end up appropriating the land.
Okay, yeah. So the different actors here. So the two main actors we will be referring to is the Tatmadaw, which is the Myanmar security forces, a combination of their military and police force, etc. Okay. So we will generally think of them as the perpetrator, which is the official government security forces. We will generally think of the Rohingya, the ones who get displaced and become refugees, as the victim, right? But there's a third actor, like in some of our analysis, it will come up. There's also the majority population that are the neighbors of the Rohingya. Okay, so they are generally, so the majority population in Burma, the main ethnic group is the Burmese. Okay, and then there are a bunch of different minority ethnic groups, including the Rohingya, but not just limited to Rohingya. There's like Kachin, there's the Rakhine population, there's many different minority ethnic groups. Okay, and so the conflict is often between the Tatmadaw, the security forces, against each of these ethnic groups. Okay, and so one, something that's been well documented in the other non-economic social science literature is that the majority Buddhist population are often the collaborators of the Tatmadaw. Okay, and so something that'll show up in our analysis later as well is the actions by the majority Buddhist population, and in particular, some extremist Buddhist monks when they share, aggressive information about the Rohingya, like dehumanizing them, right? And also spread fear about how these Muslims are coming in and posing a threat to the Burmese population, right? So that also, there is reason to believe that that type of rhetoric also leads to some of this conflict, right? And we'll try to track that later as well. But in the general sort of in the international press, there has been a lot of conversation about how Facebook posts by extremist Buddhist monks have been precipitating events for the conflict.
Cool, thanks.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for making me pause on that. Sometimes when you're in it, you forget that some of the basic facts would not be clear to everybody. All right, so what were we doing? Okay, so here's where we were. So remember just to remind everybody, the coefficient that we're going to be focusing on is beta, which is the effect of increases in the international price of rice, especially in the areas suitable for growing rice, on conflict in that location. Okay, so we are merging. So what we're going to be doing is merging by location, right? Areas like what is the conflict that's happening in that particular township as a function of whether or not it's a rice suitable area, and whether or not that conflict differentially increases during high rice prices in the international market. Okay. And so that's exactly what you end up seeing. You see a positive coefficient, right? Which is that especially in areas that are rice suitable, in periods when the domestic price of rice goes up, there's an increase in violence against civilians. There's an increase in violence against civilians committed by the state forces, the Tatmadaw, right? And there's also an increase in looting and property damage. So these dependent variables are being collected from the ACLED dataset, which is an international database that tracks all conflict events. So their procedures are like tracking exactly who, is there any, tracking like newspaper reports of conflict, and they try to identify the exact location of the conflict. Okay? So there are different ways that we could have measured the dependent variables. So what I'm showing you here is the occurrence of a conflict in that particular location, like in location I in time t. You could also measure the number of fatalities, or you could measure the number of people affected, etc. Right? So we also do that. It's in the paper. The results don't really change. The reason that we opted for the binary indicator for occurrence of a conflict, and that's the main specification that we're showing you, is because that is least subject to measurement error, right? Whereas like figuring out the exact number of fatalities, especially in a conflict region, might be difficult. So, and it also makes it easier for us to tell you about what the effect sizes are. So what this is telling us is that when the price of rice, the international price of rice, moves from a relatively low price, so 25th percentile of months in terms of rice price, to the 75th percentile. So we're looking at that interquartile range. And what happens is that in the townships with mean value of rice suitability, you have 1.3% increase in the violence against civilians. Okay, on the 1.3% increase in the probability of violence against civilians in that location. Okay, and then, so this is for all of Myanmar. So notice the number of observation is 34,000. Okay, but given our specific, I mean, so that is establishing that in Myanmar, say, unlike coffee growing regions in Colombia, right, we are observing an increase in violence when the local commodity, in this case, rice rather than coffee, local commodity becomes more valuable, right? Whereas in coffee growing region in Colombia, you end up seeing that when people are busy with growing coffee, they become less likely to engage in violence. Okay, and then but that's all of Myanmar. But the second thing we'll look at is Rakhine State in particular, where the Rohingya reside. And the reason we're doing this is because of our particular interest in the way I motivated this talk about understanding the narrative that Aung San Suu Kyi is selling about the Rohingya. Okay, and here again, you observe the exact same thing, even within Rakhine. So I'm now throwing away the rest of Myanmar data. So we have many fewer data points, right? So we have potentially much more sort of statistical power issues, but we're not changing our analytical approach at all. We're still using the international price of rice. Okay, and you still see it's all positive coefficients. We lose statistical significance on looting, right? But you still see the exact same story that within Rakhine, the areas that are more rice suitable are the locations where you see greater violence during periods of high rice prices. Okay, and now when I look at the effect sizes, right? This was a 1.3% increase in all of Myanmar, right? For that exact same change in rice price moving from 25th to the 75th percentile, right? In the townships within Rakhine with mean rice suitability, we actually see an 11% increase in the probability of violence against civilians. Okay? So it's the violence seems to be much more concentrated and much more, not only concentrated, but also much more sensitive to changes in the economic motivations within Rakhine in particular. Okay, and then there is a whole series of robustness checks that we do, but I'm not gonna go over everything. I'll just quickly summarize. So one is, you might worry that imagine that other than rice, right, there might be other minerals or other natural resources, right, that happen to be co-located with rice suitable areas. Okay, and so we directly get data on that and control for that, right? I mean, you'd have to tell a story, like for that to be a concern, you'd have to tell a story that like both rice suitable areas and minerals are co-located, and minerals also become more valuable during the same periods that rice becomes more valuable and higher priced. Okay? But even then I would say, look, ultimately, our story, which is that we just need to understand whether there's systematic economic motivations, that would still be true, right? But this very specific mechanism we're talking about, which is about expropriating land for rice, that might not be true. Okay, but anyway, so we control for natural resources, and you end up seeing there is small changes in the magnitude of the coefficients, but the general story still holds, right? You can change kind of the time path, like looking at lag rice prices by 1 month, contemporaneous, 2-month lag, 3-month lag, etc. Once we get to 3-month lags, we start losing statistical significance, right? We can also do a 3-month moving average. We can, it turns out OLS, the reduced form, show the exact same thing, even if you forget about the instrumental variables of domestic rice price instrumented by international rice prices, right? You can, like collapse the data into quarterly. So you basically end up getting like across a bunch of sensitivity checks, you end up getting the exact same story. And the other...
Before moving on, perhaps there's a couple of questions from Garance and Rajesh about the magnitude of the effects. Do you have a sense of how much of the violence is explained by these? How does it compare to, for example, what Andrila and Juan find in their paper of the sort of elasticity of coffee prices to violence?
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent question, something we should do. Off the top of my head, I haven't thought through it. Jaya, Paula, have you had the chance to think about this question of like, how do our magnitudes compare against, say, the Colombia results? I don't think we have yet. So we'll have to do it. I think that's a really excellent question. And the second question, I'm also just like repeating to note down, I think this really excellent point, which is like, when we look at the month-by-month variation in violence, right? How much of it can we attribute to this particular economic motivation? Right? Like decompose the variation of violence, which is also a really excellent point. We just were not smart enough to think about how to doing that yet. But thank you, Garance, and thank you, Rajesh, for that comment. Okay, and yeah, but I also have a lot of like trust in my co-authors that I might see by the end of this talk, like somebody would have figured this out. So, but I'm not, no pressure, Jaya or Paula. Okay, so I'm going to now move on to step 2. So step 1 was, just to summarize, step 1 was, right, you know, in contrast to Aung San Suu Kyi's story. By the way, I keep talking about Aung San Suu Kyi. Of course, there's been a coup in Myanmar since, right? But this, so now, like a lot more people in Burma now care about like what the Tatmadaw is doing. But we're talking about a time where people within Burma didn't seem to care too much about this particular ethnic minority. And Aung San Suu Kyi, the Nobel Prize winner, was going to the International Court of Justice and defending the Tatmadaw's conduct in front of the international community. So this is like this, for those of you who've been following the recent politics in Myanmar, so all of this data and everything we're talking about predates the most recent coup. Okay. Okay, so now the second thing we're going to do, now we're going to move from causal statements to more descriptive statements, is this VAR methodology, which is just a statistical framework to help us describe better in a richer way how different actions and reactions kind of react to each other and how they evolve over time, right? So each variable that we will look at the dynamics of is going to be assumed to be a function of past values of itself, right? So violence by the Tatmadaw and period T is a function of what happened in the previous, in T-1, T-2, T-3, etc., right? And past values of other variables, such as they might be reacting to an ARSA attack, right? So we're going to allow for that as well. And past, both current as well as past values of violence against them, where they were the victims rather than the perpetrators, right? And then we're gonna have to make some assumptions to be able to show this, some minimal assumptions to shut down like reflection problems where the variable ends up being a function of itself. Okay, and so what we're going to describe in a series of graphs I'm about to show you is how the ethnic militia attacks, the Tatmadaw attacks, ethnic militias are like, say, Rohingya or the Kachin, like the minority ethnic groups, okay? And then the Tatmadaw are the Myanmar security forces, right? And how these are related to each other over a period of 30 days, okay? And we are interpreting, I just want to be careful that you should only interpret these as correlations. We're just showing the time path of these correlations because I think they're instructive. And then we're also going to be using the strategy where we say, look, I'm going to show you the time path of the Tatmadaw reactions to the Rohingya. And then I'll show you the time path of the Tatmadaw reaction to another ethnic group like the Kachin. And by contrasting the two pictures together, we might learn something, okay, about whether the reactions are different, right? The reason they're not causal is that I'm going to use, so when I look at the time path of what happened in the last 30 days, I'm starting with an event, and that event might be an ARSA attack on the Myanmar security forces, right? But that event may itself have been precipitated by something else, right? But we're not looking at the determinants of that event. That's the sense in which this is not causal. Yeah. All right, so here's the first picture, right? So essentially, think of the way to read these graphs is that on the x-axis we have the time series, so days since up to 30 days since the precipitating event, and in this case, the precipitating event, the activity we're starting with, is a violent incident where the Rohingya militia, ARSA, was the perpetrator, right? So what this is showing you is that once ARSA, the precipitating event on this day, on day 0, the Rohingya militia commits an attack, which gets recorded in the ACLED data, right? Do they commit any further attacks over the next 30 days, right? And on the right side, what we're seeing is, like, after this precipitating event, over the next 30 days, what happens to Tatmadaw-initiated attacks on Rohingya civilians? So think of this as the precipitating action, and this is the reaction over the next 30 days on the Tatmadaw side, as well as on the Rohingya side. Okay, so what you see is, and we're trying, we're measuring incidents in both cases, right? What you see is that after there's one precipitating event, there is a very large, persistent, disproportionate reaction from the Tatmadaw. Okay, so the Rohingya commit some kind of an attack, and then there's an immediate reaction of 1.5 events that particular day on average, right? But then, 7 days later, there's another spike in events. And this is using all of the data. So this is like on average what happens after every Rohingya initiated event. So initial reaction, then there's a reaction, and then there continues to be some reactions over the next 30 days. Okay? So that's how the Tatmadaw responds to the Rohingya. It's quite heavily, right, and disproportionately. And here's what it looks like when the Kachin militia, another ethnic group, they happen to be Christian rather than Muslim, right, in a different part of the country. So here now we're looking at the exact same data set, but where we define the precipitating event to be the Kachin militia attacking the military, okay? And what you see is that the day that the Kachin militia attacks the military, there's also equal reaction that particular day where the Tatmadaw react by attacking the Kachin, okay, militia. And then what you observe, what's different here, is that the reaction looks perfectly symmetric, right? It's not disproportionate. So that's what we're contrasting against what happened with the Rohingya. Okay, and similarly, not just Kachin, like another closer comparison we can do is the Rakhine minority. So there's another minority that lives in Rakhine state, but they're not Muslim. They're not the Rohingya. Okay, and you see even within the same state of Rakhine, right, when there's any event precipitated by the Rakhine, there is an equal, opposite, proportionate reaction. Okay, so this is, the Rohingya conflict just seems very different, right? So this again undermines the narrative that Aung San Suu Kyi was pushing at the International Court of Justice about how there's violence on both sides. There is actually a much more asymmetric violence on the face of it, but also asymmetric relative to every other interethnic conflict. Okay. So basically what we're saying here is that comparable ethnic conflicts do not exhibit, within Myanmar, do not exhibit the same pattern, whereas Suu Kyi was stating that this crisis stems from an internal armed conflict between the two. Okay? It's not proportionate. Okay? And there's a second thing that we want to test, which already came up in one of the questions, which is, this general anti-Muslim sentiment among the majority Buddhist population, right? Is that a cause of any of the violence that we see? Okay, so is there any systematic connection between the popular anti-Rohingya sentiment, sometimes expressed through Facebook posts, sometimes expressed through like street protests against Muslims, right? Or things like Muslims are dangerous, or this Muslim man came and raped a Buddhist woman, and things like that. And does that, when you have these types of events happening, which are initiated by the civilians, not by the military, right? What does that do to subsequent violence? Okay? And there's been a lot of documentation in the international press of the extremist Buddhist rhetoric. Some of it has, like Facebook actually has gotten into some trouble of this, and I remember like Facebook reached out to us at some point to try and figure out if we can collaborate in some way, because they're in the process of trying to also like clear their names. So Facebook has been used as a platform of choice to spread like this anti-Muslim rhetoric among the majority Buddhists. And there's been documented like growth of anti-Muslim speech. And what we're going to be looking at if we're using our data, using NACLIT data, is does this type of speech predict military intervention? Okay, so here the precipitating event now is a protest, anti-Muslim protest by monks, by civilians, right, by religious leadership in the country. Okay, and we're only looking at the precipitating events in Rakhine State. Okay, when there's a Buddhist protest against Muslims in Rakhine State. And so if that's the precipitating event, here's what happens to Tatmadaw reactions, attacks on violence against civilians, where the Rohingya are the recipients of that violence. So you see that on average, whenever there is a protest led by monks, right, on average, you see 14 days later to 20 days later, there's a spike of violence against civilians by the military. Okay, so this seems to be, I mean, this is still descriptive, right? Because who knows why this protest had started. Okay, so the non-causal, like why I'm saying it's not causal is that imagine that the some Rohingya did perpetrate something against a Buddhist person, right? That could lead to both this event as well as this event. That's what I mean by non-causal. So, but you see that these two things seem to be temporally correlated, which is there's a protest, and then 20 days later, on average, you see violence against civilians. Okay. Okay. So now the final thing I'll talk about is, consequences of a crisis from using data from our Coxbazar panel survey. This data on the refugees that we've been collecting for the last couple of years. Okay. So we collected this data initially, it was an in-person survey, but also during the COVID period, also because we were all interested in tracking the effects of COVID, not only in Bangladesh as a whole, but in the refugee camps in particular, where we were really worried that given the dense settlements in the refugee camps with 750,000 people suddenly showing up and us having to make space for them, that COVID might pose a particular threat in that area. That's why we continued collecting data. Yeah. So the survey here is a panel survey of 5,000 households. About half of them are refugee households, so people who are registered as Rohingya refugees in southern Bangladesh. But we also collect data on the on what we call the host communities. So Bangladeshis who are living both near as well as a little bit distant, but in the same district from the refugee camps. Okay. And this survey, the base was conducted in 2019, the first round, right? Whereas the displacement had occurred starting in middle of 2017. Okay, okay. And then we have both qualitative and quantitative components to the survey. Okay, so just the descriptive stats here are quite astounding. So we have 3 different populations that I'm showing you on the 3 columns. So this is the population of interest, which is the Rohingya who were displaced in 2017, that big group that came over to Bangladesh. But then we also, in our surveys, found Rohingya who had been displaced prior to 2017. So in July 2017, they were already residing in Bangladesh, often not officially as refugees because we were not taking refugees at the time. Okay? And then there's the Bangladeshi hosts. Okay? So what you see is that 87% of the Rohingya who were displaced in 2017 report a traumatic event, right? And what are the most common traumatic events? That's in the arrows here: forced isolation from others, having a near-death experience, forced separation from family, witnessing the murder of a family or friend, right? Or there's some kind of non-natural death of family or friend, or torture, right? The majority of, like, if you just do torture and near-death experiences, the majority of Rohingya who've been displaced have had to experience this. Okay? So this is a very unusual population in terms of the extent of the trauma that they've had to endure. Okay? Okay, and then the dependent variables here, I can actually read it because I can't see the top of my slides. I think it's indicators of depression. Okay, so we instituted something that's standard in literature called the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire, right? In order to measure depression. And so you see that the rates of depression are unusually high, right, in this population. So the Rohingya who've been displaced for a long time, who've been living in Bangladesh as refugees for a long time, right? women, 39% of women indicate depression, 24% of males, right? The 2017 influx, you see similarly high rates of 31 and 27, right? But we also need to note that even in the host population, like the very poor communities that these Rohingya who have come into, right? They also have remarkably high rates of depression, right? And but you see something that shows up in the data is that the underlying indicators of depression are a little bit different, where a lot of this trauma was due to conflict and violence, whereas a lot of the trauma that the host communities report to us are due to domestic violence events. Okay? And just to give you a sense of how common these are, right? I'm just using as benchmarks, like the exact same Harvard Trauma Questionnaire administered to other populations. So this is the level of trauma reported by residents in Japan, Fukushima, a year after the nuclear disaster from about, I guess it was about 8 years ago now, right? And this is the level of trauma, using a similar questionnaire for the Syrian refugees who arrived in Germany after 2014, what they express. And this is the level of depression in the US general population, right? So this is quite high relative to other like traumatized populations. And I mean, we're showing this partly to say that, Aung San Suu Kyi's claim that, look, these are just like isolated events and with exaggerated, right? That doesn't seem to be true. All of our descriptive data suggests that these are not isolated events that happen. Like an entire population was displaced and prior to that faced a tremendous amount of trauma, including torture and near-death experiences. Okay. So what have we shown you? We're right on time. That there seems to be systematic economic motives behind the ethnic persecution of Rohingya in Myanmar. Right? But that's true in Myanmar as a whole, but we also see it's true in Rakhine State in particular, right? And the Myanmar army persecution of the Rohingya seem to be disproportionate and severe relative to every other conflict that's happening in the country, right? And then we have really grave human costs of the crisis, okay? So one of the other things that, the part that I didn't have time to show you, right, is that not only are there traumatic events, the other thing that we can track on our side, on the Bangladesh side of the border, is what happened to assets and resources of the Rohingya, how much they lose, right? So you observe that it turns out that a point that I've been trying to make to my compatriots in Bangladesh, and I'll tell you why in a second, is that if you look at the distribution of assets and like prior to 2017, just before they were displaced, the host communities and the Rohingya who were subsequently displaced, before 2017, their distributions were exactly on top of each other. Okay, and then what you observe after 2017 is that the displaced Rohingya distribution just moves way to the left. Okay, so they lose a lot, and the amount they lose seem consistent with what we find in the economic motivation section, like of our analysis, the rice price stuff that I was showing you. Okay? So that's another way to verify and validate like what we observe on the Myanmar side with, or what people are reporting to us on the Bangladesh side with the types of displacement and loss and resources that we observe on in the rice price database. Okay? And so the data in general, why I said and warned young researchers maybe not to take on projects like this is that one of the key contributions here is that there is an International Court of Justice case that's going on, right? And right now there's a lot of competing narratives and people saying, no, look, we don't have good data on either side. And our goal here was just to bring some systematic quantitative data to this debate, which ends up undermining Aung San Suu Kyi and the Myanmar government's narrative in the way they defended themselves and their conduct at the International Court of Justice. Okay, so that's maybe not. I mean, the reason I was warning young researchers is that maybe not a good enough reason to write an economics paper. Right? In our case, we were just particularly. It's just very close to home, the particular issue. So it was important to us to write this paper. But beyond that, we are also the contribution we're making that I'll try to make clear here is relative to the literature on the drivers of conflict, right? So there was this rapacity effect versus the opportunity cost effect, right? And you observe that unlike coffee in Colombia, we see the rapacity effect dominating, right? that even though it's kind of the opposite, which is rice, it's really good to grow rice this year. And it turns out that leads to an increase in conflict, not a decrease, unlike what you observe in Colombia. So why would that be the case? The difference here is that if you have a situation where there are two sort of almost equally powerful groups that are competing over land or resources, right? The dynamics of that conflict is very different than if there's a powerful group that is just expropriating and oppressing another group, right? The incentives for oppression might increase precisely during periods when that resource becomes more valuable, right? And that might be why we are seeing a different effect than something that has been documented in the literature. And I would say that would be one of the main contributions we make to the literature on, the general literature on the drivers of economic induced conflict. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So to the attendees, if you have any questions that you want to ask, just raise your hand virtually and I'll open your mic. I see that Patrick Francois has a question. So let me open up your mic, Patrick.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mushfiq. I think it's super interesting. I guess I have a question about the motivation. So, I think it is actually an important insight that economic motives seem to be a really important driver of the conflict. But I think the narrative that you're attributing to Aung San Suu Kyi, I don't know if anyone really believes that she even believes that. At the time, her objectives were trying to not cross any of the military's red lines, right? So the military clearly have an interest that comes from their own strategic interests in Rakhine State, and they are looking for precipitating events. And I think it's important to know, that what you're establishing here is those precipitating events are locally economic, and that's somewhat surprising, right? Given the relative unimportance to them of rice. I mean, it's just not that important to the military compared to jade and all the fantastic wealth to the east. So that's important, right? But the fact that, and you kept referring to it in the talk and probably in the paper too, that this is about disproving Aung San Suu Kyi's narrative. I mean, does anyone believe that narrative? That's the first thing. I just ask one more question, and this is just the comparison, I think, with the Kachin, the Kia, who have their own army. I mean, really, there's a huge difference in military capacity across those two parts of Myanmar. So I think that the within state comparison is really the meaningful one there. And I think that is meaningful and important. I think the other ones, you could make those comparisons probably across the whole of Myanmar into those other areas where the military has almost no capacity. They're almost independent states. So I think that's, not as good a comparison. So that's it. Thanks.
Okay. No, both useful comments. I actually, that doesn't even necessarily need a response right now, but I take your point, Patrick, and we'll be careful in writing. But like the only response I'll say is that if you look at not just what Aung San Suu Kyi was saying at the International Court of Justice, but even in other events where she's just speaking to, say, a BBC journalist, right? And then making comments about, oh, I didn't realize I was going to be interviewed by a Muslim. Why did this happen? Why wasn't I warned before? Right? So there are lots of things she's done overall, not just at the International Court of Justice, that suggests that we should not be giving her anything like a free pass, just because not only is she maybe she is under pressure to represent Myanmar in the military because of the very vulnerable, unstable peace that they're trying to negotiate. But on the other hand, I think she's gone out of her way also to say things and do things that were probably not necessary either, right? So I think, my reading of this conflict, of the Rohingya conflict in general, is that it's not just a military. There is a general fear of this particular Muslim minority in Myanmar, some of it, through these, viral Facebook posts, some of it coming from Buddhist monks, right? So it's like a much more generalized problem where the political parties, Aung San Suu Kyi and the military, they're reacting not only because they themselves believe it, but because it's actually politically prudent for them to otherize and victimize the Rohingya.
Agreed. Yes. Thank you.
I'll take the chance to jump on Patrick's point before. This is a super interesting case because to some extent, if you have a purely ideologically motivated conflict or purely politically strategic motive, you wouldn't see that much response to the change in economic incentives, right? So, and the last part that you mentioned on the Facebook posts and so on are a little bit more reminiscent of David Yanagisawa's work in Rwanda, where you just need something to flare the prayer and move the masses, right? And what the evidence that you've shown suggests to me is a little bit that we are in an in-between case in which the military wants to act, but they need the local population to some extent. So perhaps trying to show who are the ones who end up gaining from or appropriating these economic surpluses could be very useful to understand better the dynamics of the conflict. No.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we won't be able to get. I don't think we'll be able to get like large sample data on exactly who expropriated and who was the beneficiary, but we could do a more thorough job of looking at both English language and Burmese language sources on exactly what happened to that land over time to be able to at least describe this. There's that, and then there's actually something else, that some other dimension of kind of how to interpret what's happening in this conflict that I'll add. That I personally believe, I don't have like really strong evidence behind this, is that, you know, the long-term strategy from the 1950s, 1960s have been slowly and silently like disenfranchising Rohingya, marginalizing them, right? Making their life difficult, but making their life difficult in a kind of a slow and steady way, such that it's in their interest to just leave, right? And we see this type of an approach actually is much more general and common. It turns out that, you know, a country where half my family's from, the Cayman Islands, like this type of thing is happening, where the local population is just being slowly pushed out, where I have friends who've just decided, oh, we cannot but leave this island just because the cost of living is now so expensive, right? And so like a very different mechanism, but it's leading to essentially an erasure of a culture as well, right? And I think that's what the long-term strategy of Myanmar has been, okay? Which is like, okay, let's just like slowly push them out in ways that doesn't really attract anybody's attention, okay? And then I actually think what ends up happening is that when ARSA has committed like some attacks, right, when they are actually, you know, like suffering a lot, then in exchange they do there's a flare up of violence, and then that leads to such a huge reaction in Myanmar, right, that it ended up being a strategic error on their part, right? And it was a strategic error because suddenly people noticed what was happening, right? And it would have been better for them to just like do it silently, right? And just like get the Rohingya out slowly. But of course, the cost of that is that it has to happen slowly. Like it can't just, like you can't just like burn an entire village down.
That's super interesting. Now we have another question from Katsushi Imai. You can unmute yourself, Katsushi.
Hello, thank you.
Yep.
My question is that
you're breaking up a little bit. Can you please repeat your question? Otherwise, while Katsushi fixes his audio problems, we can move on to Nikhil's question.
Hi. So I wanted to ask, what role do you think popular democracy, kind of initiation of democracy has played in this conflict? So I'm thinking of a counterfactual where Aung San Suu Kyi is not there at all. So you have the military, the junta in power, and how would you kind of visualize the conflict in that context? And an added question was, how has this changed intergroup conflict? So what does your research show about conflict between groups and not via the military? So how has that changed?
That's actually a really good question. I want to now go back to something Patrick Francois mentioned earlier as well. So I think maybe I'm using the phrase Aung San Suu Kyi too often in this talk, and maybe we're doing this like too often in the paper, so we should go and correct that, okay? Because I actually believe, in response to your question, right, even if Aung San Suu Kyi was not there, she just happens to be the vehicle, right? And the reason we're mentioning it is because she is the most prominent vehicle. I'm particularly pissed off that she is a Nobel Prize winner, right? And the world thought of her as a hero. I'm particularly pissed off that I thought of her as a hero when I was growing up, right? And it's been especially big disappointment. But she is just like, I actually think this is the case where if there is a democracy, like you were saying, Nikhil, right?
Yeah.
That if the majority Burmese population's beliefs, right, partly elevated through the Facebook posts and the extremist monks, etc., right? If their belief is that there's a minority population that poses a threat to them, right?
Yeah.
Then it doesn't really matter who's in power, right? Like and it doesn't matter whether there's a democracy or a dictatorship. In fact, democracy might be worse in that particular case, where it acts as a tyranny of the majority. I do think we, our foil is not Aung San Suu Kyi. I think it's the entire population. And then, by the way, like we're picking on Myanmar here, but this is no different. Like ultimately, this is no different from not only Hifazat-e-Islam, the political party in Bangladesh that thrives on ethnic conflict, where in this case the Muslim majority are the perpetrators and Hindu minority and other minorities are the victims. It's no different from the party in power in Pakistan and the uneasy alliance they've like Tehreek-e-Insaf, like the Imran Khan's party, and the uneasy alliance that they have with the mullahs in Pakistan that leads to Ahmadiyyas, including, like, say, Atif Mia, who's one of the most brilliant economists in our profession, right? The persecution that they've had to face, okay? It's no different from the party in power, the BJP in India, and the persecution of minority Muslims and others in India. There's been like this, this nationalistic fervor that's been happening. It's happening in the United States as well. It's happened in China, given what's been going on in Xinjiang province, right? It is everywhere. Like it's not. I think it's not a unique problem, but like what's happened in Myanmar is that they've been able to get away with something that looks a lot like genocide, right? But on the other hand, what's happening in Xinjiang also looks a lot like genocide.
Right. I think that we're just on time. I apologize, Sushi, that your mic couldn't make it work. But let's just wrap it up here. Thank you so much, Mushfiq, for a super interesting conversation and a presentation, and Paula and Jaya for the fantastic work they've done on the chat. We'll make sure to get you all the questions. So just a couple of announcements. Mushfiq will be available to chat about research with anyone interested. It will be in his Zoom link with Giacomo just posted on the chat. And in a couple of weeks, on October 5th, we'll have another VDEV CEPR BREAD talk with Karen McCourse from PSC. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, and hope to see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you.